Welcome to Reformed Thinking. We are so glad you are joining us for a brand new deep dive today.
Yeah, thanks for being here. We have a really fascinating discussion lined up.
We do. And today's goal is to examine two really robust texts that totally dismantle the modern corporate-style approach to church governance.
Right, which is a massive topic right now.
It is. The sources we are looking at are called Servants of the Chief Shepherd, which analyzes the first part of 1 Peter chapter 5, and another text called Under Holy Siege, looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 11.
And these texts pull no punches. They lay out a massive contrast between what the culture expects and what the biblical blueprint actually demands.
Yeah, they really do.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about this to kind of set the stage for you, the listener. Think about what happens when you walk into, a really popular franchise restaurant.
Okay, yeah, like a big chain place.
Right. The entire experience there is engineered for your physical and psychological comfort. Like from the moment you step through those glass doors, every single detail has been optimized by corporate focus groups.
Oh, for sure. The lighting, the music, all of it.
Yes. The ambient lighting is kept soft so you don't get eye strain. The booths are padded to this specific density so you stay long enough to buy dessert, but, well, you don't stay so long that you hold up the table for the next group.
That is so true. It is a completely managed environment.
It really is. Even the background music is chosen to subtly encourage a relaxed pace. And the primary goal of that establishment is straightforward. Make the customer happy, keep them consuming, and ensure they leave a glowing 5-star review online.
Right, because that is how the franchise hits its quarterly growth targets. The absolute metric for success in that specific environment is consumer satisfaction.
Spot on.
It is a completely market-driven ecosystem. If the consumer is unhappy, the business model has failed, and management will immediately pivot. They will alter the menu or redesign the building to win back the market share.
Because the customer's preference dictates every operational decision.
Yeah, precisely.
But then, imagine you leave that super comfortable restaurant and you step straight into a frontline medical tent in the middle of a literal combat zone.
Wow. Okay, that is a jarring contrast.
Right. The sensory shift is intense. In that medical triage unit, no one cares about the ambient lighting.
No, definitely not.
No one is asking if the canvas cot is soft enough for you or, if the sterilized surgical instruments are aesthetically pleasing.
They're just trying to keep you alive.
Exactly. The primary goal in that tent is not customer satisfaction at all. It is treating lethal wounds, stopping arterial bleeding, and guarding human life under intense, chaotic pressure.
Right, the atmosphere is urgent and entirely focused on survival.
And a surgeon might have to cause immediate, severe physical pain to save a life. They do not sit around waiting for a 5-star review to validate their methods.
Yeah, the metric for success shifts entirely from comfort to preservation. The medical personnel are executing a life-saving mission under extreme duress. Their validation comes from the fact that the patient is alive, regardless of whether the patient, actually enjoyed the surgical procedure.
And that striking contrast right there brings us to the core mission of our deep dive today.
It really is the heart of the issue.
Our sources argue that contemporary ecclesiastical culture frequently mimics that franchise restaurant.
Yeah, the texts point out that the modern system treats the local congregation like a demographic of consumers to be appeased.
And it treats pastors like corporate chief executive officers managing a religious brand.
Which is a massive collision with the historical apostolic blueprint laid out in the text.
It is. So let's unpack this corporate crisis a bit more.
Yeah.
The sources critique the contemporary landscape heavily.
They really do. They describe this infiltration of market-driven pragmatism.
Right, and what is often labeled a seeker-sensitive methodology. How exactly does this corporate mindset infiltrate the way a local congregation operates?
Well, the texts detail how the secular world measures leadership, right? And how those metrics have been imported straight into the religious sphere.
Like personal branding and numerical statistics.
Yeah, exactly. In a worldly paradigm, success is quantified through building a brand, accumulating financial advantages, and having visible charisma.
And to maintain those high attendance numbers, the texts note that the modern ecclesiastical CEO frequently avoids polarizing doctrines.
Oh, absolutely. The goal is to cast the widest net possible. So leaders will smooth down the sharp edges of theology to avoid offending the religious consumer.
Which means it becomes leadership measured by physical expansion, wealth, and human applause.
Right. If the budget is growing and the parking lot is full, The leadership just assumes the blessing of God is present.
But the standard presented in our documents today is the polar opposite of that.
It really is a totally different universe.
A leader is expected to deny himself, take up his cross daily, and act as a steward of the flock. Leadership here is not about gathering attention or building a massive personal platform.
No, not at all. The sources make a really sharp distinction. They note that a formal title might grant a man administrative authority, but only grace can make him an actual shepherd.
Right. It is about holy influence purchased through immense personal sacrifice.
Yeah.
So let me play devil's advocate for a second here.
Okay, go for it.
If a church is growing numerically and the budget is solid and, the people in the seats seem perfectly happy and well-adjusted, why do the sources argue that this corporate model is so dangerous?
That is the big question, isn't it?
Right. Like, what is the actual harm if people are showing up and feeling good? Does a large crowd just mask spiritual starvation?
Well, according to the sources, the danger lies entirely in the shifted metric of success.
How so?
When a local congregation changes its primary measurement from the objective holiness of the people to the attendance numbers on a Sunday morning, it actively endangers the spiritual safety of those individuals.
Because they compromise on the truth to keep those numbers up.
Yeah, the authors argue that prioritizing numerical growth inevitably demands theological compromise.
Right. If the ultimate goal is just to keep the seats full, the leadership will naturally stop preaching against specific sins that might cause people to leave.
And they will avoid rigorous theological training because it requires too much mental effort from the audience.
So they replace the objective truth of Scripture with entertaining psychotherapeutic speeches.
Which leaves people happy in the short term, much like customers eating high-sugar food in a comfortable restaurant.
Wow, yeah. But they're actually starving.
Yes. The texts argue they are starving for the actual substance of the Word of God. And this starvation leaves them entirely vulnerable to false doctrine and eventual moral collapse when real adversity strikes.
That makes total sense. And the authors provide a really fascinating historical parallel for this exact dynamic.
Oh, super apostles.
Yes. The super apostles in the ancient city of Corinth. These were men who infiltrated the Corinthian church after the Apostle Paul established it.
And reading the description from the text, they sound like the ancient equivalents of modern prosperity gospel hucksters.
They really do. Tell us a bit more about them.
Well, the description of these super apostles reveals a lot about human nature. They were highly skilled rhetoricians.
Which was a big deal back then.
Huge. In the Greco-Roman world, the ability to speak with persuasive, entertaining eloquence was highly prized. It was basically a primary currency of social advancement.
So these men fit perfectly into those philosophical expectations.
Yeah, and the sources note that they demanded exorbitant financial compensation.
Right. They used their high pay as proof of their professional worth.
Exactly. Much like a modern consultant who charges a premium just to appear more legitimate.
That is such a good point. And didn't they also boast about mystical experiences?
They did. They boasted of ecstatic visions, spectacular signs, and dreams to claim a superior spiritual status over Paul.
Because they looked at Paul's physical weakness, his poverty, and his constant suffering, and they basically mocked him.
Right. Their argument was that true divine favor would manifest as wealth, health, and societal prestige.
They were essentially offering the Corinthians a crown without a cross.
Yeah, that is a great way to put it.
Like, you get all the spiritual benefits, the status, the excitement, but completely without the suffering or the call to rigorous self-denial.
And it is the exact same temptation facing the modern church today.
It really is. Now, to find the actual antidote to this modern crisis, the texts direct us to look at how the Apostle Peter addressed early Christians.
Specifically, Christians who are facing literal physical persecution.
Right. This involves an analysis of 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 through 4, and the context here is key.
It is. The context of Peter's letter provides a massive contrast to that comfortable corporate model we just talked about.
So who is Peter writing to?
He is writing to elect exiles scattered across regions like Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia.
Which covers vast areas of modern-day Turkey.
Yeah. And historically, this document dates to the early to mid-60s AD.
Okay, so this was a period marked by rising, really visceral social hostility.
Oh, for sure. The believers in these regions were experiencing intense pressure, public slander, and severe household tension.
Just because of their allegiance to Jesus Christ?
Right. They were socially vulnerable pilgrims living on the margins of society, often viewed with intense suspicion by their pagan neighbors.
So we are definitely not talking about comfortable officials sitting in a quiet, air-conditioned office managing a portfolio.
No, not at all. These are shepherds trying to guide a frightened, weary flock through a very dark cultural valley.
And look at how Peter identifies himself in the opening of the text. Given his resume, he totally could have pulled rank.
He really could have. I mean, he was one of the inner circle of three.
He walked on water.
Yeah. He stood on the mountain during the Transfiguration. He could have demanded total, unquestioning submission based on his elite apostolic status,
But instead, he simply calls himself a fellow elder and a witness of Christ's sufferings.
which is quite revealing when you examine the history of the man holding the pen.
The text really highlights Peter's catastrophic public failure here, doesn't it?
It does. This is the man who vehemently boasted of superior courage, claiming he would face death before abandoning Jesus.
Yet, he fell asleep in the Garden of Gethsemane when commanded to keep watch.
And a few hours later, he denied even knowing Christ 3 separate times to a servant girl, just to save his own life.
But the text also highlights his restoration on the shores of the Sea of Galilee.
Right. Where the risen Christ asked him 3 times, "Do you love me?" and responded to Peter's affirmation with the direct pastoral command, "Feed my sheep."
So Peter writes this letter as a humbled, restored failure. He does not write like an untouchable celebrity demanding admiration.
No, and the sources argue that his history of failure practically equipped him to shepherd others.
I think about it this way. A leader who has never failed might secretly harbor the belief that their success is due to their own intellect, you know?
Yeah, their own strategic brilliance or moral fortitude.
Right. But a leader who knows the bitter sting of their own cowardice and who has tasted the unmerited grace of restoration is entirely immune to the illusion of self-reliance.
They know beyond a shadow of a doubt that they are standing purely by grace.
And the sources argue that this immunity to self-reliance completely alters how a leader executes their duties.
It changes everything. Because Peter knows his own weakness, he proceeds to give 3 strict defining contrasts for how this oversight must be conducted.
Okay, let's break those down. What is the first one?
First, he writes that it must not be done under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have it.
Meaning a shepherd must not be dragged into duty by external pressure or institutional guilt.
Right, or the fear of human opinions. It must spring from an internal duty toward God and a genuine affection for Christ.
That is a high bar. What is the second contrast?
Second, oversight must not be for shameful gain, but eagerly.
So this directly addresses those base motives of greed and careerism we saw with the super apostles.
Yeah, the exploitation of souls for personal financial advantage. A faithful shepherd is eager to pour himself out because the flock itself is precious.
Not because the flock is a stepping stone to a better salary.
Precisely.
And the third contrast is where the text really hits hard against the modern grain.
It does. Peter commands them not to be domineering over those allotted to their charge, but to be examples to the flock.
This feels like the difference between a domineering manager and a seasoned trail guide.
Ooh, I like that analogy. Unpack that a bit.
Well, a domineering manager stands at the back of the line, right? Yelling orders, cracking a whip, and telling everyone else to march forward into the mud while his own boots stay perfectly clean.
Yeah, taking 0 personal risk.
Exactly. But the biblical concept of an example is like a trail guide navigating a treacherous mountain pass.
Right, the guide walks at the very front of the line.
Yes. They hack away the dense brush, they test the stability of the loose rocks with their own weight, and they take the hardest, most dangerous steps first.
They only ask the group to follow where they have already walked and assume the initial risk.
Right. And building on that, a leader who refuses to take the difficult path first has lost all moral authority to command others.
The positive model of leadership presented by Peter is exemplary holiness. The shepherd's life constitutes a major portion of his public instruction.
His daily habits, his response to harsh criticism, his self-control under stress, these things preach just as loudly as his formal sermons.
The text asserts that he cannot simply direct from a safe, theoretical distance. He must tangibly embody the doctrine he proclaims.
So while Peter gives us the clear commands for how to shepherd, the Apostle Paul provides a striking window into the agonizing internal reality of actually carrying out those commands on a daily basis.
He really does. And the sources point to 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 through 29 to illustrate this.
To really grasp the weight of Paul's words, we need to establish the historical picture of Corinth. We mentioned the super apostles earlier, but the city itself requires some specific context.
Yeah, Corinth was a massive cosmopolitan hub. Geographically, it was situated on a narrow isthmus, which made it a crucial commercial highway between the Aegean and Ionian seas.
And with that extreme economic prosperity came a culture dominated by moral laxity and philosophical pluralism.
It was famous for the Isthmian Games, which cultivated this intense civic obsession with physical prowess, competition, and oratorical excellence.
Furthermore, the city was notorious for the worship of Aphrodite, effectively institutionalizing immorality into everyday civic life.
Right. Human prestige, wealth, and rhetorical vanity were the ultimate currencies of social advancement in that culture.
And Paul steps straight into this hyper-competitive, wealth-driven environment and delivers what scholars call his fool's speech.
Yeah. He recognizes that the Corinthians are completely infatuated with the arrogant, self-promoting boasts of the false teachers.
So Paul reluctantly agrees to play their game, to play the fool, and offer his own catalog of boasting.
But he totally subverts the entire Greco-Roman genre of self-praise.
He really does. Instead of listing his elite educational pedigree or his spectacular organizational successes, he unleashes a breathtaking catalog of physical humiliations.
The list provided in the text is just harrowing.
It is hard to even read.
Paul details receiving 40 stripes minus one from the Jewish authorities on 5 separate occasions.
He was beaten with Roman rods 3 times, a punishment that often broke bones and caused severe internal damage.
He was stoned and left for dead outside a city. He suffered 3 shipwrecks, spending a night and a day adrift in the open sea, clinging to wreckage.
He outlines a life of constant travels fraught with perils from rivers, violent robbers, his own countrymen, Gentiles, and false brethren.
He describes a daily existence marked by constant weariness, painful toil, sleepless nights, hunger, thirst, cold, and nakedness.
I mean, I'm reading this list, and it is just an avalanche of physical trauma.
It is overwhelming.
But then the text points out this exegetical pivot, a moment where Paul completely flips our understanding of his suffering.
Right. After listing all of that horrific physical violence, Paul focuses entirely on verse 28.
He writes, "Apart from the things outside, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches."
And the sources identify this verse as the theological crown of the entire passage.
To appreciate its gravity, the authors unpack the original Greek terms Paul utilizes, which is so helpful.
Yes. The phrase translated as the pressure upon me uses the Greek noun epistasis.
Tell us about that word.
Well, in extra-biblical classical Greek literature, like the histories of Polybius, epistasis is used to describe a sudden, overwhelming military assault.
Wow.
Yeah, it refers to the hostile, physical siege of a walled city by an invading army, or the crushing, suffocating weight of a massive mob pressing violently into a narrow space.
So Paul is comparing his mental state to a city surrounded by an invading army. That paints a vivid picture of constant, inescapable psychological tension.
It illustrates a really intense internal reality. And that siege is immediately defined by the next term, merimna.
Which translates to an agonizing protective anxiety, right?
Right. In classical literature, merimna is often used to describe a mother's fierce, protective anxiety for her vulnerable children.
Or a guardian's sleepless vigilance over a precious, threatened estate.
Yes. So when you combine these terms, Paul is declaring that the doctrinal dangers, the moral failures, and the structural conflicts of the local congregations gather like a hostile military force to launch a daily siege against his mind.
Every single morning, the spiritual state of the churches assaults his conscience.
And the sources also draw a line from this concept back to the Old Testament.
Specifically the idea of masa, right?
Yeah. Masa is a Hebrew term frequently used in prophetic books, often translated as the burden of the Lord.
It denotes a heavy prophetic weight placed by God upon the soul of his servant.
It represents a message of impending judgment or crucial truth that the prophet must deliver with absolute fidelity, regardless of the personal cost.
The authors argue that the spiritual leader's mind is not a playground for personal opinions or creative ideas. It is a fortress under siege, bearing this divine burden of guarding the covenant community.
It is a massive weight to carry.
I have to push back here, though, or at least ask the question that naturally arises for you, the listener, when you read this.
Okay, what is it?
How can a mental burden, this merimna, realistically outrank the physical agony of a shipwreck or the flesh-tearing reality of a Roman beating with rods?
That is a really fair question.
Are we underestimating the sheer physical horror of ancient torture, or is the spiritual reality of leading a church simply that intense from Paul's perspective?
It presents a real paradox to the natural mind. but the texts argue that Paul's worldview establishes a clear hierarchy.
Okay, unpack that.
The external world could beat Paul's physical body. It could break his skin, starve his stomach, and freeze his limbs. But those external physical afflictions could not touch the eternal destiny of the souls entrusted to his care.
So the spiritual reality, as argued by the authors, is that the eternal safety of the church is of vastly greater consequence than the temporal comfort of the physical body.
Right. Paul uses the phrase, apart from the things outside, to draw a sharp boundary. The physical pain was peripheral. The inward spiritual pressure of pastoral custody was the true core of his apostolic suffering.
He was willing to endure the destruction of his flesh if it meant the doctrinal purity and moral holiness of God's people were preserved.
And that completely refutes the modern, prosperity-driven idea that spiritual success guarantees bodily comfort.
It really does. Paul's validation as a leader was not immunity to suffering, but his willingness to absorb that deep, painful anxiety for the flock.
But Paul's protective anxiety wasn't just a feeling, right? It demanded a system of action.
Yeah, if you are under a mental siege for the safety of others, how do you actually govern them?
The sources point to a framework outlined by J. Oswald Sanders, detailing 4 pillars of scriptural governance.
And these pillars provide a highly structured framework for executing this massive burden.
Right. Sanders categorizes the responsibilities into 4 areas: ministry to others, applied discipline, guidance, and initiative.
Let's start with the first one, ministry to others. This completely inverts the worldly hierarchy we discussed earlier.
It does. The sources mention a concept from Field Marshal Montgomery, reflecting on military structure.
Right. He asserted that the military staff exists solely to assist the troops on the ground.
The staff remains largely anonymous, executing logistical duties purely for the welfare of the frontline soldiers, not to accrue glory for themselves.
The sources also reference A.B. Bruce's classic work, The Training of the 12.
Yeah, Bruce notes that in earthly kingdoms, the rulers consider it a privilege to be attended to by others. They measure their status by how many people minister to their needs.
But in the divine commonwealth, the rulers consider it a supreme privilege to minister to others.
The authors assert that a spiritual leader prioritizes the welfare, comfort, and doctrinal stability of the congregation far above his own career advancement, financial security, or personal ease.
Moving on, the second pillar is applied discipline, based on texts like Galatians 6.1. Now, church discipline is a topic that makes a lot of modern congregations incredibly uncomfortable.
Oh, absolutely. It goes against the cultural grain of extreme individualism.
But Sanders lays out 5 rigid guidelines for restoration to ensure it is handled correctly.
And those guidelines are presented as crucial for preventing ecclesiastical abuse while maintaining congregational holiness.
What are they?
First, the leader must conduct a thorough and impartial inquiry, ensuring no favoritism or personal bias clouds the judgment.
Second, they must consider the overall benefit to the work and the individual.
Third, the discipline must always be executed in a spirit of love, not vindictiveness.
Fourth, spiritual restoration must be kept constantly in view as the final goal.
And fifth, the entire process must be heavily bathed in prayer from start to finish.
I think about it like setting a broken bone. If you fracture your arm in a fall, the medical procedure to realign that bone is going to cause acute severe pain in the short term.
Oh yeah, the doctor has to physically manipulate the broken pieces back into place.
But that pain is entirely necessary for proper healing. If you ignore the break because you want to avoid the temporary discomfort, you guarantee a permanent, crippling deformity.
That is a great analogy. The sources apply that exact logic to the spiritual realm.
What happens when a church ignores applied discipline for the sake of modern tolerance?
The authors argue emphatically that leaving a brother or sister in unrepentant sin without warning them is actually a form of hatred.
Wow, hatred.
Yeah. From their theological perspective, it allows a lethal spiritual infection to spread unchecked. True biblical love warns the offender, corrects the error, and seeks to restore them to fellowship, even when the confrontation is agonizing for everyone involved.
That is a heavy truth.
It is.
The third pillar is guidance. This is defined as knowing the destination through the objective Word of God, rather than relying on demographic surveys, focus groups, or personal intuition.
According to the text, a leader cannot assert his own reckless will or demand blind obedience based on his personal preferences.
Guidance requires a strict alignment with the absolute sufficiency of Scripture, ensuring every step the congregation takes is directed by the counsel of God, not the shifting winds of cultural opinion or market trends.
And the final pillar is initiative. The sources describe this as rejecting the dismal fungus of safety.
That is quite a phrase, the dismal fungus of safety.
I know, it really paints a picture. True leadership demands bold, faith-driven risks for the advancement of the kingdom. It is the willingness to step out into the unknown when the outcome is not guaranteed.
They cite the missionary Hudson Taylor's approach to leadership as a prime example here.
Yeah, he was known for bearing the blame when logistical plans failed, prioritizing the physical comfort of his fellow missionaries over his own, and willingly modifying his own plans to avoid causing unnecessary offense to his team.
The text highlights Taylor to demonstrate that the frontiers of God's kingdom are never advanced by men paralyzed by caution or obsessed with self-preservation.
Initiative means accepting heavy responsibilities with gladness and refusing to complain about the exhausting busyness of the task.
But here is the stark reality for you to consider. All four of these pillars, the self-emptying ministry, the painful application of discipline, the unwavering adherence to guidance, and the bold initiative, they are completely impossible to sustain through sheer human effort.
Oh, without a doubt, you would burn out in a month.
Exactly. The sources argue they demand a specific theological anchor.
The entire discussion anchors itself in the person and work of Jesus Christ. The authors identify him as the chief shepherd, noting that he fulfills all four of these pillars with absolute perfection.
Every act of human leadership is framed as a subordinate reflection of his ultimate work.
And the sources draw a fascinating parallel here. They compare the merimna, that intense anxiety we saw in Paul, to Christ's merimna in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Paul was besieged by his concern for the safety of the churches, but Jesus faced something infinitely heavier.
Right. In the garden, he faced the terrifying absolute weight of divine justice.
The contrast is vital to the text's argument. Paul suffered for the sheep, absorbing physical blows and mental anxiety to preach the gospel to them.
But Christ did not just suffer for the sheep. The theological claim is that he died in the exact place of the sheep.
In Gethsemane, he experienced a crushing pressure that caused him to sweat great drops of blood because he was about to take on the total legal responsibility for the sins of his elect.
He absorbed the unmitigated wrath of God on the Roman cross to secure their eternal redemption.
The authors rely on a specific theological framework to explain how this applies to the leader today, referencing Chapter 11 of the Westminster Confession of Faith, which deals with justification.
And the Westminster Confession articulates that a person standing before a holy God does not depend in the slightest degree on their own pastoral fidelity, their moral excellence, or their leadership skills.
Justification is grounded entirely in the obedience of Jesus Christ, which is imputed or legally credited to the believer by faith alone.
Theologians divide this into Christ's active and passive obedience.
The text explains that his active obedience refers to his perfect, sinless fulfillment of the moral law during his earthly life.
And his passive obedience refers to his willing submission to the penalty of the cross, paying the exact debt of our sins.
Because that justification is a totally finished work, leaders do not labor to earn God's favor.
Right. Their agonizing work, the bearing of that heavy burden we talked about earlier, is an overflow of the fact that they are already accepted.
They are not striving to gain an identity or secure their salvation through their pastoral output. They are functioning out of a secured identity that has already been guaranteed by Christ.
That is a crucial distinction.
Let me push on this point, though, because I know people listening might see a contradiction here.
Okay.
If a leader's justification is entirely secured by Christ's perfect obedience, why do they still experience this crushing epistasis, this mental siege?
Yeah, that is a common question.
Doesn't a theology of free grace mean the leader can finally just relax, put their feet up, and stop stressing about the moral failures of the church? If the spiritual bill is already paid, why stress?
That is an accusation frequently leveled against the doctrine of free grace, but the texts argue the exact opposite reaction occurs.
How so?
Because the leader's eternal standing is secure, they are finally free to spend themselves entirely for the good of others without the paralyzing fear of divine condemnation.
Ah, I see.
The siege they experience is not driven by a frantic fear of losing their own salvation. It is driven by a holy, protective love for the bride of Christ.
They agonize over the flock precisely because they understand the immense price Christ paid to purchase those sheep with his own blood.
According to the authors, grace does not produce lazy shepherds. It produces shepherds who are willing to suffer because their final inheritance is untouched by earthly failure or organizational collapse.
Understanding this finished work dictates how a church must be structured and how every believer must act.
And the texts lay out some very strict boundaries for how a local congregation is meant to operate based on this theology.
The sources are highly specific in their application, defining firm boundaries. First, they reject charismatic continuationism.
Right. The texts argue that the miraculous sign gifts like speaking in tongues, prophetic visions, and immediate healings were temporarily granted to authenticate the foundational office of the apostles, and that these gifts ceased permanently with the close of the biblical canon.
Therefore, the authors contend that modern leadership must not rely on seeking subjective mystical experiences, but rather must focus entirely on the rigorous expository preaching of the completed written word.
The sources also demand specific structural boundaries regarding governance. They advocate for a strict complementarian order, referencing 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus chapter 1.
Which reserves the specific office of elder and pastor for qualified men.
The texts argue that this complementarian structure is not an arbitrary cultural hierarchy or a relic of ancient patriarchy, but a divine design reflecting Christ's headship over the church.
Furthermore, the sources operate within a consistent dispensational framework.
This involves maintaining a clear structural distinction between the nation of Israel and the church, viewing the church as a distinct entity awaiting a pre-tribulational rapture and the premillennial physical reign of Jesus Christ on the earth.
The texts insist that leaders must guide their congregations with this urgent eschatological expectation.
It really provides a very specific, rigid framework.
It feels like looking at an architectural blueprint for a large house. When you examine a blueprint, certain walls are designated as load-bearing.
Right. They might seem inconvenient if you want an open-concept living room, and you might prefer the aesthetic of tearing them down.
But they are structurally necessary. If a homeowner decides to ignore the blueprint and knock down a load-bearing wall just because it fits current design trends, the entire roof is eventually going to cave in on the family.
The texts are arguing that these biblical commands, complementarianism, church discipline, the focus on the objective word, are not arbitrary political preferences.
They are the structural, load-bearing walls designed to keep the spiritual house from collapsing under the weight of the surrounding culture.
You cannot alter the blueprint without compromising the integrity of the shelter. However, the texts do not restrict the application of these principles solely to the men holding the office of elder.
Right, they expand this mandate beyond the pulpit to every single believer in the pew.
Everyone has a sphere of influence. A father shepherding his children through a difficult cultural issue, an older woman teaching a younger woman how to manage her household.
Or a mature man modeling sobriety and strength in a hostile secular workplace. Everyone bears a local, concrete responsibility for someone else's spiritual good.
The texts draw a sharp contrast between the super-apostles who constantly sought the spotlight and the obscure, quiet faithfulness of everyday believers.
The authors assert that much of the most significant spiritual excellence is entirely hidden from public view.
It is the believer changing diapers in the nursery so young parents can listen to the sermon.
It is the Sunday school teacher spending hours on a Friday night preparing a lesson for 3 easily distracted children.
It is the person quietly visiting a sick saint in the hospital, or the friend who bears a heavy emotional burden for someone in crisis without ever posting about it online or seeking recognition.
That obscure, unglamorous faithfulness is the actual lifeblood of the church.
While the secular corporate model dictates that you use people to advance yourself, the biblical model insists that you spend yourself for the good of others.
Bringing all these elements together leads us to the final, lasting reward for this grueling labor, which frames the conclusion of the sources.
Let's recap the central thesis we have covered today.
The sources argue that biblical leadership is a life of self-emptying ministry. It involves carrying a massive, internal mental siege of merimna for the doctrinal purity and holiness of God's people.
And this immense burden is sustained only by resting in the finished, imputed justification provided by the chief shepherd.
The final reward is noted in the promise from 1 Peter chapter 5. When the chief shepherd appears, the faithful will receive the unfading crown of glory.
The applause of men, the metrics of the corporate world, the wealth, the prestige, all of that is a fading wreath. It vanishes the moment the culture shifts or the economy turns.
But the commendation of Jesus Christ is permanent.
It changes your entire perspective when you realize that the final evaluation of your work does not come from a board of directors, a congregational vote, or a social media algorithm.
Right. It comes from the shepherd who knows exactly what you endured in secret.
It frees the believer from despair when no one notices their labor, and it frees them from pride when everyone applauds.
Because the only approval that carries eternal weight is the smile of Christ.
Exactly.
We want to leave you with a direct challenge to consider today. Think about the obscure, quiet leaders in your own life.
The pastors, the parents, the mentors, the Sunday school teachers who bear a daily mental merimna for your soul behind closed doors.
Think about the late nights they spent in prayer, the anxiety they felt over your spiritual safety, and the heavy burden they carried when you were wandering off the path.
How does understanding their hidden, agonizing burden change the way you pray for them this week?
And perhaps more pressingly, how does it challenge your own willingness to step into the fray and bear a similar, crushing burden for someone else tomorrow?
The reality is, the battle for souls is not fought in comfortable padded booths with focus-grouped music.
No, it isn't. The battle is fought in the mud, in the blood, and in the sheer urgency of that frontline medical tent, where the only thing that matters is guarding the life of the person bleeding on the cot next to you.
That is the biblical call to leadership.
Until next time, keep studying the sources, keep asking the hard questions, and keep guarding the truth.